lost 5 great. I was asked to kind of give an overview of some of the kind of a small subset of what we do, but our business is primarily managing invasive aquatic weeds for clients that are lake associations. We also do quite a bit of work treating algae and then doing those types of things. So I guess I was just asked to kind of give a quick overview of putting what's available to put into the water to target algae, both kind of reactively or post-bloom or preventatively from a pre-bloom standpoint. So it's kind of quick overview. I want to talk a little bit about cyanobacteria, why we target it, regulatory environment. That can be different anywhere you work. Algae control options being things you place in the water to target algae once you have a bloom condition. Nutrient inactivation is more a technique that's widely used to prevent blooms from happening. Algae are single-celled organisms. They have to get, not like a vascular plant, they have to get the nutrients they need dissolved from the water column. Plants like Eurasian milfoil are thriving in a lake like Lake Tahoe right now. It's an extremely electrophic lake. They can get everything they need through their root system. Water's crystal clear, so you got an opportunity to manage nutrients in the water column. You got an opportunity to manage the carrying capacity of the lake to produce algae. A couple large-scale treatment examples, and then just ideas on logistics and program design. And tomorrow we'll probably get into costs and those types of things. So, like everywhere else, we started out about 40 years ago when Eurasian milfoil was kind of coming into its invasive aquatic weed, which you may or may not have bumped into, but it was charging through eastern United States. I grew up in Michigan, started doing quite a bit of work on it. It's something that'll, one fragment comes in on a boat trailer, 5 years later, your whole littoral is over a 1,000-acre lake and completely overrun with it. So, treatment options. Done a lot of work with herbicides to control it. We've done a lot of work with harvesting equipment, a little bit of work with biological control. That's kind of been a core of our business. But like everything else, over 40 years, the lakes you work on become more eutrophic, nutrient flows are coming in, and you get stuff like this popping up. Cyanobacteria are critical from the standpoint of the toxins they produce. You've heard quite a bit about the kind of short-term impacts these things have. There's a couple of compounds that cyanobacteria produce that are actually now implicated in longer-term diseases like Lou Gehrig's disease and things like that. So if you live on a water supply that's been delivering water for years, there are some places around the United States anyway now where statistically they've got clusters that are quite a bit higher from some of these things. So there's some potential that long-term exposure to these things is an issue as well. There's a cyanobacteria species in the southeastern United States that grows on a plant called hydrilla. It's an invasive weed that's running our reservoirs over that's actually been directly implicated in avian brain wasting diseases. The coots have been eating this stuff. American coots, they're basically bald eagle food when they're moving fast. This stuff causes vacuoles to form in the nerves, so they lose the function of their legs and arms. The eagles are picking them up left and right. It's just going right up the food chain. So these types of things, in addition to just causing you problems from a really stakers and a health perspective, and other longer-term effects that I think people just maybe start to understand. So at some point you have to manage it, and that's that. So next point I wanted to make is all these things I'm going to talk about behave in a regulatory environment. And when we're putting something in the water from an application standpoint, it's after groups like ourselves worked through a process with a client to determine that this was the best option for their lake and that type of thing, or someone like Harry on a larger scale. We get hired a lot of times to implement programs where they've decided that these technologies are the best fix for this lake, and they've got to kind of come along and get them in the water. In the States, and I'm sure you've got similar systems up here, at the federal level, algaecides are things that kill algae. There are a number of situations where you might want to come in and target or reduce a population of algae in the lake, and that's what those things are specifically designed to do. In our country, they're registered by the Environmental Protection Agency. There's a very extensive process that a manufacturer has to go through to get a yes or no decision on whether he can ever sell, bring the stuff to market and recover their investment in it. So generally, they don't start down the process of trying to register things that have a low probability of meeting the safety standards they need to meet. these things in the water. Once they're registered, they're available, nationally for sale. But then the next level of safety comes in is every person that applies these things has to be licensed. And they have to understand the laws and regulations that make these things safe to use. The label itself on a container is the directions that you have to follow to put these things in the water safely. If you don't follow, you're violating federal law. A lot of times, homeowners, for example, will buy a gallon of something to treat the weeds off their dock, and you can't believe that this gallon of water is going to cover 3 acres, and they use twice as much as they're supposed to, and then at some point you're beyond where that thing was designed to be safe. And so the licensing is really important too. And lastly, most states have a permit system that they've looked at their particular water quality issues within their state. They've come up with a permit system that regulates how these things go in the water. Copper algaecides are a good example. Fish like, if you live in the southeast where the primary fishery is bass or some of these other species, they're not sensitive to that. So there may be a higher tolerance in the state's permit system to allow the use of those technologies. Other states like Washington, some monids like salmon, trout, they're real sensitive to things like copper. So the permitting is different from state to state generally to tighten these things up. Nutrient inactivation, by the other hand, it's not generally considered to be a pesticide. So a lot of the oversight that some of these other things may have to go through to get registered are considered, a pesticide. The definition of pesticide is, in the states anyway, is anything that you put into an environment to target a pest. Like, for example, Algaecides, which is a food-grade dye, they make a claim on their label, if you put this in a lake, it prevents the growth of aquatic weeds and algae. They made that claim on the label, so they had to go through and get it registered as a pesticide, or they had to take that wording off the label. But nutrient activation technologies, they're still generally some sort of a permitting system that the state or at least the local, in our country, that each state's got to administer, sort of something similar to administer the environment that has a program that regulates that. So any of this stuff that I'm going to talk about goes through a number of levels before it gets in, before it gets to the point where someone like myself is kind of bringing it up, putting it in the water. These are the things you have to think about in terms of, are these things applicable to the waters that we're managing from the fisheries perspective? Those are all things that you've got to kind of keep in the back of your mind. So they've got some systems for that. So there's kind of two ways to go after algae once it's in your lake. You've got proactive, reactive management is generally coming out and targeting a bloom once it occurs. There's 4 or 5 different algaecides that are registered within the United States, and I think 1 or 2 of them may have registrations in certain parts of Canada. These things that are, you've got a bloom condition like that, might jump up on a drinking water supply. That is a drinking water supply on the right there. That's the city of Ashland down in southern Oregon. They've got an algae bloom in their reservoir, and they take that water and put it in their treatment plant before they deliver it. If you're chlorinating organic material like algae, at some point, if the algae counts are high, you're forming chemicals that are potentially carcinogenic, and you're not allowed to deliver them. So they have to maybe go out to the reservoir and knock down the algae populations prior to running it through a treatment plant. Those are some conditions where something like that might happen. If it's a blue-green algae bloom, then obviously you don't want to be putting that through a plant. So there are situations where potentially it makes sense to go out and use an algaecide. There's 3 basic algaecides that are available and registered, and most of them that are what been used forever are generally copper-based. Copper is kind of a required micronutrient for plants and animals. If you look on a 1-a-day vitamin back label, there's about 2 milligrams of copper in a 1-a-day vitamin. If you're treating algae in a lake, the application rate's about 0.2 milligrams per liter, so about 1/10 of that amount goes into a liter of water. But these have been used forever because they do not have any water use restrictions placed on them. They can be used in drinking potable water supplies. They've been certified for those types of things. They get into they do a very good job. The obvious problem with something like that is it's an element. It's not going to break down anything. And if you've got a reservoir where you're out there just treating it every week for years and years and years and years, at some point you're going to have a copper mine in the bottom of your lake. Copper sulfate was generally the most common product that's been used for years because it's relatively cheap. Copper sulfate, though, is something when you apply it to water, especially water that's a little bit hard, it basically reacts with the carbonates in there and forms copper carbonate, which is insoluble and sinks like a rock. If you think about trying to target algae and get them into the, something like, if you're putting something in the water, you want it to stay in the part of the water column where your target is long enough for it to get into the system and do what it's supposed to do. The harder the water is, the faster copper sulfate applications will basically form a precipitate and fall to the bottom and not do anything. So for years and years, the methodology was just they'd be treated a lot more often because they weren't getting the effectiveness of what they're trying to do. So I guess in the 70s or so, chelated coppers were basically designed. That's attaching a copper molecule to kind of an organic carbon, substance that kind of keeps it in water in solution longer. And the carbon is actually picked up by an algae cell. They're looking for carbon. So it's a methodology to improve the efficacy or the uptake of that, get it in the system. The last couple of years, they've been adding technologies to kind of, they're single cells, right? How do you get the stuff from cell to cell once it's in something like a long kind of a filamentous type algae like that. So they've been adding some technologies that actually are penetrating agents and are things that kind of get it in the cell, move it around. So again, the objective is to kind of try and reduce the amount of treatment agents. This is just a couple of examples under the microscope of pre and post treatment. And the idea is you're trying to reduce the population of cells in the water through treatment to the point where it's a better situation to be had. Another kind of newer technology that's just been registered by EPA is a product called C-Clear, which is actually a combination of an algaecide and a phosphorus sequestering agent. In this case, it's aluminum sulfate, basically. By blending these things two together, people can kind of go out and make an application, then tie up some of the phosphorus that gets released from the cells that they're targeting. And the idea there is to get away from having to do repetitive treatments to deliver the same level of weed control. Probably the most interesting thing that's come along in the last couple of years is we've had registrations now, for products that are basically kind of a peroxide. The breakdown byproducts are these. So this is something that's probably getting more and more of a role in terms of going out targeting algae in systems. If you think back to the first slide I showed you, the blue paint down the shoreline there, you can come into a lake and physically, if you've got things like windrow there, you can come in and physically treat that chunk of water and not have to deal with the entire lake, but you can really come in and target these things. There's also some thought that the oxidation process has some impact on some of the toxins that are produced, so kind of get away from that. This is a quick example of a drinking water reservoir in the California aqueduct system. This was treated, I guess, about a year and a half ago by our group. They were bumping into cyanobacteria problems and moving them into the treatment plant and that type of thing. So this is just cell count, cyanobacteria cell count, or plankton biomass. You can kind of see what kind of a rapid, this is what, 2-3 days, a couple days, about a week. You can see what kind of reduction you can get in algae populations in a system by using these things, and that's why you use them. But they have to be part of what's going to happen at some point is this is going to go back up. So the drawback of a reactive type of approach is that you have to come up with a threshold, you have to monitor when the thing gets to a threshold, you target it, it comes back down, but you have to expect it's going to come back up. So, yeah, Jim,
what's the mode of action?
That's an oxidizer. It basically just oxidizes the cells and that type of thing. My dog got sick. The vet tells me to pour a bottle of it down his throat and make him throw up. I'm going, you're out of your mind. But apparently a single-celled organism like algae is a little less complex than my dog. But it's something that from a standpoint of what's left when you're done with it, it's a huge improvement over something like copper. It costs more, but it's a new tool kind of in that particular toolbox. Just pre and post treatment pictures. They're having some filter clogging of the plant there, which is really why they wanted to target that. Back to alum. So then the other two technologies that I think are operational in terms of going into a lake and targeting. If you come in here and control the phosphorus, like Harry said, you can manage the carrying capacity of a lake to produce algae. You could probably, there's also a lot of school of thought that you can even shift the types of, you maybe shift away from breeding species by, bringing the phosphorus down and the nitrogen ratios and things up. So these things were all, the alum treatments are probably the primary technology that's been around. It's been around for 40 years. It was developed in the Clean Lakes program where back in the 70s and 80s, our country at least, they spent quite a bit of money in learning how to, learning how to fix things. So they put a whole bunch of money in different kinds of research. They had some failures and had some pretty good successes. But this is operational, as Harry said. These are kind of two different situations. This is the lake that Harry mentioned, where this is his, not his. It's the hypoluminic aeration system is inside this little square here. And it's about 150 feet deep there. And that was kind of how they designed there. That was in the water for about 20 years, and I guess this year, it's a machine. And at some point, because the city manages this thing. So what happened was basically they were looking at having to replace the power plant or the system there. So they were weighing the same thing. When they put this aeration system in, they had a grant from the state and maybe the federal government.
It was a grant from both to do the study and do the design, and then we conducted a study for the county and the city to determine. They were basically looking at spending $100,000 to $120,000 a year on O&M for the old system to keep it going. And we did the nutrient budget and came up with a recommendation that, okay, it's time to put it to bed and use that O&M money for a maintenance alum treatment.
Okay, well, this is kind of the first couple passes of an alum treatment kind of going in the water. So we've got boats that are basically moving back and forth on a pattern there. That first shot I showed you of blue-green algae that along the shoreline there, that was taken in this lake in 2012. This year they didn't experience any type of blue-green algae bloom in this particular lake. Whether that continues to go on, they're here into this basically. But this is a situation where this is more like Harry was talking about stripping. This is really designed to seal the bottom. It's designed to try to target the phosphorus in the water column and control, blooms that particular year. It worked extremely well for them. This lake is, if I did my math right, is about 1/20th the size of Pigeon Lake. It's about 1,200 acres. Like I said, if I did the math right, it's 24,000 acres. So this is about a 3 or 4 day application. It costs about 80,000 US, 90,000, something like that. So that's kind of one level of this. This other project over here, the Canyon Lake one, that's a similar sized reservoir in Southern California. It is a place where our government has set what's called a total daily maximum load, and they've assigned responsibility for phosphorus inputs to a number of different agencies like the Flood Control District and people like that. They went through a whole process of trying to come up with ways to target the phosphorus in this lake. In this particular case, they're responsible for paying for tying up and removing X pounds of phosphorus every year. And again, that's a technology where alum's got a real big role to play. We have to monkey with their rates a little bit. Here, we work a lot of different groups, and Harry doesn't do them. We usually have to read them. Just some quick pictures of operations. This is kind of the way these alum treatments work. You have to have a staging area. The stuff comes in semi-tankers. You've got a closed system where you've got a hose system that transports down, couples into a tank. You can turn those things around in about, what we try to do is turn a truck around in 2 hours, because in 2 hours they start charging us to be there. But we can, you generally empty and apply those in a couple hours. Bunch of different systems, different people use. We have a number of systems with fan jets on them that allow us to cover about a 40 or 50 foot pass without worrying about knocking into docks and breaking pieces off and things like that. We also have booms that inject, can be put on there to inject under the water. We've got smaller boats that work in other areas, but this is kind of how it works. right soon after the boat comes past, the chemical reaction Harry mentioned takes place. This is the flock that forms. It just kind of starts settling out through the water column if it's done right, and grabbing phosphorus and algae and other things like that. The other product that we've been working a little bit was, or the lanthanum products Harry mentioned, Phoslock, which just recently came to market. So just a little bit of history of that. We took over a contract in Orange County in 2010. And one of the problems in Southern California we had is these lakes are all hyper-eutrophic, and in some cases these lakes are actually taking reclaimed water straight from the treatment plant. So phosphorus levels that are getting delivered are through the roof. They're way higher than anything you can see in the natural lake system. Really significant cyanobacteria blooms, and we have a lot of. It's hard sometimes. You mentioned going back to Harry's chart where you cut off at 9. A lot of times the pHs in these are way higher, and we've had issues with alum treatments that float. It's just hard to get stuff to work, and we had an opportunity to work with this a little bit. So Phoslock is basically something that was developed by the Australian National Science Academy back in the late 90s. They commercialized it and gave it to an Australian company to start selling. And they spent most of their time kind of working in Europe, but it's kind of similar technology in terms of how it's applied to something like aluminum sulfate. You apply it to the surface of the lake, it comes down through the water column, it's got bonding sites, it grabs phosphorus. After application, if you dosed it right, it sits on the bottom, it can grab stuff and kind of comes back up. A couple things that we've liked about it in those particular lakes is that the water quality doesn't have an impact on really on the performance of the sequestration of phosphorus. By the same token, the application itself doesn't do anything to change water quality. So and it's got a ratio you can kind of calculate there. So like I said, it's been used in Europe quite a bit. It's been used a little bit in Ontario. We've got about 2 years of experience with it, so 3 years, I guess. So that's kind of the limit of our knowledge. But just a couple of projects I'll run through. This is some anecdotal stuff. This is the Mason Lake Park that takes the reclaimed water. Basically, they had a fill line on this lake that was on like a flow, right? So it's down to a certain level of the water from the treatment plant comes. We had to modify that to the point where you could put a meter on it and a cutoff valve. So now we can control the water that's coming in. We usually use it in the summer. We can calculate how much phosphorus is in it. We'll come back and bump it up from time to time. We've been able to keep the cyanobacteria blooms down to nothing. This is a small system. This is about 10, 12 acres, maybe a little bit bigger, but not much bigger. Another project we've got a couple of years of data on. This is Lake Lorraine outside of Seattle. There's a stream that comes in here from a really urban environment, stream that goes out here to another lake downstream. Had pretty high phosphorus levels. We've actually been treating this lake with algaecides for a number of years. In 2011, we did the first application with this. We did try to do kind of what we call a reset, where you're targeting the phosphorus in the water column, what we think is going to release from the sediment based on sediment samples. So we did that in June of 2011. We topped it up a little bit. We added a little bit more in 2012. It's a picture of the application, water clarity, post-treatment. So this is just the data, and this is, you can see there's quite a, it's pretty regular kind of through the summer, and then, kind of a few gaps here through the winter. But the interesting thing to me was that this stormwater, Seattle rains every day all winter. And these numbers, there's a little gap here, that type of thing. We never really saw much kind of coming back in here. So we've been able to keep that lake to the point where we haven't seen any issues with cyanobacteria for a couple of years. So we did some work with the algae, just what the counts were, what happened over time in terms of species shifts. One more example, this is a lake down in Southern California. It's about 50 acres. We had to get a permit to do this one, but pretty much the same story. We did an application, we stripped it out. You kind of see a little bit of the coring that was done that kind of settles on the surface there, caps it off. And just kind of same story, phosphorus levels down. This is a little different than alum. It grabs the free reactive phosphorus that's in the water column. It doesn't necessarily grab everything like alum might. So you want to be putting it in the water when you don't want all you don't want all the phosphorus tied up in algae biomass, for example. So that's kind of something that you want to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Same lake, cyanobacteria data over the course of the summer. This project is, it's not a year old yet, so you gotta obviously, look at it from that standpoint. But if you look at the historical stuff before that, there's nothing but cyanobacteria. So that's kind of a summary of that. So the next thing I guess I want to talk just a little bit about is scaling these things up to larger lakes. And I guess I just want to throw three examples out. All these technologies can be scaled up if they're well thought out, and if the budget's there to do it, that type of thing. This particular lake is an example of a herbicide treatment that we did. It's not an algae treatment, but Lake Ponderay is just south of the British Lakes. Your province kind of goes like this, so it's not quite straight south there. But it's about 120,000 acres, 40, 50 miles long. There's a river that runs out here. This area down here is 1,600 feet deep. The rest of it up here is pretty much all littoral. They had 7,000 acres of Eurasian milfoil in there. We mapped it. We came in and we designed a treatment program to target the different, based on flowing water conditions. And it took us about 3 weeks to come in and treat the milfoil through a system that big. 7,000 acres across about 100 miles of shoreline, something like that. And a lot of those areas, that was done in 2006. A lot of those areas are still clear of milfoil now. The native plants have kind of recovered back. Another one I just want to throw out there is Houghton Lake. Similar type of a situation. This lake is almost the exact same size as Pigeon Lake. It's in Lower Peninsula, Michigan. It's shallow. Again, but most of this is littoral area. They have 12,000 acres of Eurasian milfoil in there. We were able to design a product we use called sonar that's used at very low rates. It's target selective for milfoil, so we can come in, calculate the volume, get about a 6-7 part per billion application mixed into that lake with a number of different boats, and then we would monitor the rates and redose. And the objective of these two things is basically to show you that you can scale up something that works well in a smaller pond into something that works well in a large lake system. If you've got the brain power behind it, you thought everything out, or you've got the budget to kind of come through and do it.
Did you aerial spray that?
No, did by boat. Well, this is the lake Harry was talking about, Lake Grand Saint Marine. This is just another example, and you heard his data. They did a demonstration project. They put some stuff in the water, and they were able to capture and reduce a certain amount of phosphorus. That phosphorus, once it's captured, isn't going to be, any phosphorus you take out of a lake at some point is good. So the interesting thing about this, though, is if you go on Google Earth, there's a historical bar where we can kind of move back and forth in imagery. You can actually see some of the blocks. If you zoom in tight enough, you can actually see the alum going in the water. I don't know what he did here, Harry. He must have turned it off. But this is their application rig. You can actually go on the internet and see that happen. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But it's also a good example where, at some level, they've scaled the treatment program up to the point that it demonstrated the capability to have some type of benefit to the lake. Whether or not it's going to overcome these things or not is another story. So, treatment options. Kind of last couple things to talk about. Harry mentioned these. You can do applications where you're targeting the entire volume of the lake, and the idea is just to take the phosphorus out to the point where a cyanobacteria bloom won't trigger that year. That's obviously a lot more cost effective than, from a budgetary standpoint anyway, than kind of coming into the next step, which is kind of a reload where you might come in and target both what's in the water column and what's coming out of the sediments. That's a more expensive application, whether you're using something like aluminum sulfate or something like Foslock. Other applications are, you can define, let's say for example, this line right here, this bathymetry map is the contour where stratification occurs. You've got an anoxic portion of your lake where you can come in and target areas or hot spots. Like Harry said, you don't necessarily have to make an application for the entire lake. So those are some kind of things to think about. The last couple things you need to think about, because I think you're going to spend some time talking about this tomorrow, is if you're going to use these things on a large project, there's a couple things you really have to be well thought out. The first one's production. You have to be able to get enough stuff you have to be able to buy enough stuff to put in the lake. People like Foslock, they're a smaller company, they're manufacturing overseas right now. If you decided to treat your lake with that, it may take, you know, some period of time to service you. Depending on where you are, you know, aluminum sulfate's manufactured in quite a few places around the West because it's used by paper mills. You know, so you got a lot of, you know, paper production generally. But you start talking about these volumes, you know, you might want to get, you know, that's something you really need to think about. You've got the logistics there to deliver the stuff you need, the time you want to put it in. Next thing you want to think about is shore stations. The more places you can have around the shoreline to work from, the less time your boat is spending running back and forth to get stuff, the more time it's spending being productive making applications. That has a huge factor to do with the cost in terms of, you know, and cost, you know, and that type of thing. Next thing to think about is it is a material handling operation. You're putting pretty large volumes of material. They have to be delivered to the lake. They've got to be staged at the lakeside. You've got to get into a boat safely and get out of the water and put it in. Guidance on the water is critical. Our systems are rigged with equipment that's basically adapted from precision agriculture. When you get out in a lake like this, you know, you've been out putting it on a big lake, you got, you know, it's kind of hard to keep track where you've been. So you have to have, you know, GPS guidance, and generally you want to know how much water volume. If you want to put a variable application rate, we've got systems that that calculate the water volume under the boat. So as you're driving along, it'll adjust the flow controller. So it's just kind of an automated system to get the stuff into the water evenly. You know, you don't want to put the same amount of alum in 2 feet of water as you are in 100 feet of water because, you know, there's that much more water. I think on larger systems, it's kind of important to have a bunch of boats. I think the faster you stuff to get the stuff in the water, the better. We watched, we're doing a herbicide program on a lake in Southern California that they treated with alum 5-6 years ago. They had like 1 vessel out there. You know, it's a real effective system in terms of getting the stuff in the water, but it took them a month and a half to put the material out. And, you know, visually, you never saw any change that year in what was going on. I think the data kind of supported they saw some things, but they never really got away from having much of a boom. So I think it's more important, you know, to avoid weather over, you know, periods of time. I think it's more important to have more vessels get the stuff in the water faster. That's just kind of an observation as an applicator. And then the last thing to kind of think about is water. So I guess in summary, there are technologies that work in large lake applications. Regulatory environment, you know, there has to be, you know, the understanding that we're not going to have some worse impact than what we already got, that type of thing. So that's something that, you know, permit systems or whatever, some mechanism has to be there. You know, the budget's often the limiting factor on them. You know, the bigger your lake is, the harder it is to, it's really easy to take care of a 10-acre lake, right? You know, it's more, you know, the bigger the lake is, the more that becomes an issue. And then lastly, I guess any type of a treatment program, you know, should be part of a larger strategy, as Harry said. So with that, I'll shut up. If there are any questions, I'll answer them. Otherwise, I'll be around.
Yes, more point you had in your last slide there about regulatory considerations. You know, for pesticides, it is not permissible to allow them to fish-bearing waters.
Yeah,
they do allow algaecides to be applied in very limited circumstances to stormwater ponds, drinking water ponds, and then you get the farmers who throw blocks of bluestone into their dugouts and that kind of things. But yeah, in terms of fish-bearing water bodies, to date, they've basically said no. So
yeah,
you're right that not saying that it's an outright no, it's never going to happen, but it's pretty low down. I think you have to exhaust all the other options before you consider that.
I think if I looked in your matrix, you know, there's things like, I think the peroxygen algaecide was listed kind of as a might be applicable at some point.
Yeah.
And again, if you're weighing those two things, I mean, a lot of times where people are using an algaecide is because they can't afford to do anything else, or you know, it's a reactive. Those types of treatments are a reaction to to a condition, and you know, your main objective ought to be to fix the condition so you're not growing algae. So I guess those are tools that are in the tool bag, but where does it make sense to use them? You know, for some people it does, for some it doesn't. And then you've got the regulatory
Yeah.
framework that you have to work within too.
Foslock is not an algaecide.
No.
No.
It's the same basic idea as alum.
Yes.
It's not as probably well known in the United States. It's, you know, I think we've probably applied most of it ourselves. And we're 2 or 3 years into that in smaller projects, and from what I've seen, it's really neat stuff. But I don't know that you can, it's been used extensively in other parts of the world. I don't think it's as well understood as something like aluminum sulfate, and it probably costs more. So, but I think it's still, I mean, there are places where, you know, people think maybe one's better than the other. I don't know.
I think availability is the issue with phosphate. Just getting enough.
Well, I think that's going to drive, that drives the cost too, because right now, lanthanum's a rare earth element. It's only mined in certain, you know, until about 4 or 5 years ago. If you look at it's a commodity, right? It was like 5 cents a pound. Also, it's like $1 a pound, right? And it's kind of leaking up towards the point where it might make sense to mine it in places in California. And people are looking at that. So I think. But it's market driven too, from a standpoint of a lake treatment. They have to have a certain volume that they know is going to be repetitive before.
They invest in
Yeah.
it.
So.
Because it's all coming out of China right now, right?
And then the reason is the Chinese government won't let them export the raw lanthanum. They're forcing them to manufacture it in countries, and then it's like it's going to be taxed on the. They want to capture as much of the, which makes sense.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
if you can do it, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So in your business, Terry, do you have any kind of a benchmark in terms of cost per acre?
That's all, well, for things like algaecides and herbicides, that's real easy to calculate. For things like aluminum sulfate and something like Foslock, it really is more dependent on, you have to do the sampling to calculate what, you have to know how much phosphorus you got, so you know how much to target it with, right? And that's variable from lake to lake. And then, an application is trying to strip the stuff out of the water column. It's a lot less expensive than trying to calculate everything you think might release from the sediment. So a lot of times on smaller projects, we do all that, and we do all the math, and we kind of calculate it out. Like I said, that if you just did the math on a similar treatment to that Lake Stevens treatment, it's $80,000 or $90,000 applied for a stripping dose of aluminum sulfate. It's probably a cleaner lake than Pigeon, so
Well, its second disc average is 6.5. So
Yeah.
the whole target of that is to neutralize the spring
Yeah.
external load that comes in before stratification hits, and the size is, and the dosing is dependent. Like Terry says, it's not just the phosphorus you're trying to remove, how much phosphorus you're trying to capture in the sediment, but the competition for the element you're adding. So humic materials, organic materials,
Yeah.
algae, all that is competition for the aluminum. So you have to calculate a dose that's a little more complex than the herbicide.
So the answer is yes, you can calculate it.
Yeah, just take some data.
I was trying to get a number out of you. So you're doing very well here, and you're redirect.
Well, I mean, if you had the same, if Lake Stevens was if Lake Stevens was the same size as Pigeon Lake, and you treated the exact same dose, it would cost 20 times 80,000.
Well, yeah,
Which is a bunch of money.
Lake Stevens
But
full
it-
dose is 24.5.
And the point
milligrams
is, you
per
can't
liter versus
compare.
5.
Yeah, the point is, you can't really compare lake to
0.5.
lake, because what you need to do is you need to count. Like if you're like Foslock, right? We've got a ratio of 100 pounds of Foslock will grab 1 pound of phosphorus. So if we know if X number of pounds of phosphorus dissolved in the lake, we can do the math and come up with a number and how it goes. But you have to know what that number is.
I understand. I'm just trying to get a relevant feel.
Are you calculating in water column phosphorus amounts, or are you looking at sediment core water as well?
It depends. I mean, some people, are just interested in this year. Other people, it's budget driven too. I mean, you might be able to afford to strip enough phosphorus out to prevent a bloom this year. You might not be able to afford to seal, recover the whole lake for 5 or 10 years. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't maybe think about it. It just means that.
Do you
monitor fisheries at the same time these projects go on? Because I can see you could change very rapidly the trophic status of your lake. And you have a carrying capacity of fish in the lake, and all of a sudden there'd be no food or less to it and stuff.
The things that were generally required by permit to monitor for are things like pH. I mean, you obviously like aluminum sulfate, if you're not done right, like Harry said, you can drop the pH pretty quick in softer water lakes. We track stuff like that. But the things you're talking about are generally thought about in the permit process before you ever get to, before anybody tells you you can even go launch your boat. So I mean, I think they look at our Department of Ecology will get with the fisheries guys, and they'll look at, in Washington State, they'll look at the program design, and they'll either approve or disapprove your permit based on comments they get back from, like if you're a fisheries guy, you would be in the loop to make comments, or they can either condition the permit based on a concern someone like you might have, or if there's no concern, they can go out. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but generally we don't monitor for things like that. We're generally contractors that are responding to a specification on a larger product that someone